Welcome from me. My name is Haig Simonian. Some of you may recognize the name as the previous guy from the Financial Times, now no longer, but delighted and honored to be here this afternoon to have the chance to chair this closing session of today's conference. Thanks to Professor Fair and all his colleagues. It's really been a great honor to be involved. Before I start, Professor Fair opened this morning, you'll recall, telling you something about the Kaufleuten and this particular room. You may recall that actually we were going to be in a slightly smaller room, but the demand was so great that we had to move to the biggest venue available. I've only been here twice before in 9 years in Switzerland, astonishing. Once was to hear Christoph Blocher when I think he announced his candidacy for the Federal Council. And once, if I remember, was to see Kaspar Villiger for the first time, then with Ozzy Grubel to announce the dream team at a certain bank. So, third time, this time I'm sitting on the other side of the stage. It makes a change. For those of you, because I saw many young faces as opposed to old-timers like me here, who come here regularly, you may be interested to know that this evening, tomorrow, we have potentially in the same venue a reading from Eduardo Mendoza, the greatest Spanish writer. Unfortunately, he's lost on me. And tomorrow we have Tommy Emmanuel, Australiens Gitarrenkönig. For those of you who follow the entertainment industry, you know that the usual pace is at these things, you get the warm-up act, then the middle act, and then obviously to close, Madonna or the equivalent. I think Jean-Claude Trichet is still here. I better be careful before I truly insult him by suggesting that he was a warm-up act this morning. Let's say that all the acts have been of similar weight, but each has had a slightly different emphasis. And indeed, we obviously have a different emphasis because we're coming to talk about Switzerland. We're going to talk a little bit about economics and markets, but clearly our panel is about Switzerland. And indeed, we're talking political economy here, and if I may say so, I think our panel encapsulates what the new institute is all about. After all, it's called Economics in Society. We're talking about whether Switzerland is still a safe harbour in turbulent times. So as you can imagine, we're going to be talking pretty big picture about a variety of themes, but I'm going to try, and I hope I succeed, gradually to narrow our debate to talk about economics and finance as our time passes. Just so you know how we plan it, we've slightly rearranged the schedule. We think it's a better way of doing things. We're going to ask Kaspar Villiger to give us an initial introduction of just under 10 minutes to set the scene. We want him to paint the picture for us. After all, he is the one panelist here who has experience not only of business and finance, but also obviously direct experience of government. After that, we're going to have about an hour, very roughly, for debate, which I hope we're going to make as lively and provocative as possible. And then I'm going to open the floor for the last 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Not only have I left my distance glasses at home, but with the lights in my eyes, I can virtually not see beyond the second row. So I hope those who do have questions will raise their hands, shout, stand up, and my colleagues here will help me identify you. Please feel free. The floor will later be yours. So let me start by asking Kaspar Villiger to give us his artistic opening, and to which we will respond.
Thank you, Haig. This morning, Markus Brunnermeier made a statement I liked very much, and I will adapt it to Switzerland. Switzerland is a safe harbor as long as it is perceived as safe. I think in turbulent times, there is a need for safe harbors, and Switzerland has so far obviously met this need in the past. And there are three basic questions. First, what requirements must Switzerland fulfill to continue to be such a safe harbor? Secondly, what are the current threats of these aspirations? And thirdly, how should we best deal with these threats? To be a safe harbor, I think Switzerland must be worthy of trust in the first place. Trust is essentially based on 5 criteria. First, good reputation. Second, economic strength. Third, political and social stability. Fourth, strong identity. And fifth, a stable currency. I will briefly outline what this means specifically and where these conditions are challenged. International discussions about, for instance, the behavior of Switzerland in the Second World War, or about Switzerland as a tax haven, or about alleged xenophobic tendencies in Switzerland, show that reputation problems can have serious political and economic consequences. Elements of good reputation include, for instance, Switzerland's commitment to solving the big problems of the world, the perception of Switzerland as a solidary member of the international community, or a constructive participation in the United Nations brief with one word, an open Switzerland. Economic strength is first of all necessary, of course, to maintain our own prosperity, but I think it is also a basis of the respect others are showing towards us. An economically weak Switzerland with the population of a medium-sized Chinese city would become, I think, irrelevant as a country. No one would consider investing much money here or bring money to Switzerland. I think a small country can only acquire economic strength through the exchange of goods and services with other countries. Efforts and investments may have to pay off, and it has to be attractive for the best talents to come to Switzerland. In the intense global competition, Switzerland must therefore remain at the top if we don't want to fall down quickly into mediocrity. I want to list some of the relevant factors: sound macroeconomic framework, strictly market-based economic system, moderate level of regulation, moderate public spending and tax ratios, high level of education and freedom of movement for talents, open markets, be it internally with the EU or globally, high flexibility in the labour market, or predictability regarding the continuity of the economic policy framework. I see here 6 dangerous risks for Switzerland in the moment. First, following the financial crisis, a new belief in the need for government intervention has emerged, which, if that trend is not stopped, will lead to crippling overregulation. Secondly, a beginning decline in financial discipline after positive budgets. You begin to feel now a little bit more here, a little bit more there. It begins always like that. I saw that several times. Thirdly, threats to the freedom of movement of people with enormous risks for talent acquisition and for the bilateral agreements. Fourth, threats to the predictability of the legal environment through initiatives that are based on current emotions and outrage. Fifth, targeted attacks on labour market flexibility from the left. And sixth, EU pressure on some of Switzerland's competitive advantages, which are a thorn in the EU's flesh. The political and social stability is based on several pillars. Let me just mention 3 of them: the political culture or direct democracy and federalism, then of course the general prosperity, and a kind of basic feeling of solidarity in this country, which is also reflected in the well-developed nature of our welfare state. Here there are 2 challenges that stand out. First, the loss of confidence towards the private sector, caused by the perceived improper compensation of individual managers, and I must say it, maybe also the UBS crisis. And secondly, the inability of the political system to properly adjust the social welfare system in light of the demographic challenge and of the low interest rate environment. Switzerland is also a brand. I come from the brand industry. It's also a brand, and the brand needs identity, needs distinction, needs differentiation. And this includes, of course, our political culture, just mentioned, direct democracy and so on, but also, allow me to, a personal view, I think the non-membership to the EU is a kind of our identity. And I am convinced that EU membership would sooner or later lead to the blurring of this identity. Personal view, I know others, but I think it could be like that. The challenge lies in the well-known dilemma: maintaining access to the European internal market and EU pressure lead to a progressive regulatory alignment. This can result in a situation in which national sovereignty becomes a fiction, so that Switzerland will be, in fact, an EU satellite. And at this point, I think joining the EU could suddenly become an option. A safe harbour without a stable currency, externally and internally, is unthinkable. But because Mr. Danthine is here, only a very quick comment. I think that the global monetary expansion, we heard a lot about that this morning, was necessary to keep this IFS alive. But I heard some concerns by Mr. Trichet this morning, who said you shouldn't forget that also a low interest environment on the long term can have some consequences, and I share these concerns. I fear, in a way, that this leads to a monumental and unfair redistribution from poor to rich, from creditors to debtors. It puts pressure on pension funds, and because investing is too cheap, it causes not sustainable structural distortions on the longer run. And that's a concern of myself. But I think because Switzerland is to some extent caught between a rock and a hard place, between Hammer und Amboss, oder Pferd und Wand auf Deutsch, has no alternatives, and I therefore support this monetary policy without any reserve. But I hope that the SNB finds the right moment for this, the very famous exit. What should Switzerland do now, and what should we avoid? And to conclude, I mention only very briefly 9 important points. First, the private sector needs to regain trust, because without trust, the Swiss people in a direct democracy will not grant the private sector the appropriate legal framework. This has to do with sustainable, responsible behavior of the leaders in economy. Second, we need a revival of the market economy and not of state interventionism. Only in this way will industries create the sort of values on which our wealth and state benefits are based. Third, a clever location policy must ensure that in terms of competitiveness, Switzerland remains among the best. This takes the constructive cooperation of the fragmented parties in the political centre and on the right. Fourth, the bilateral approach with the EU must be continued, but should, however, be maybe restricted a bit to that what is really necessary economically, in order not to constantly finding ourselves in a weak requester position, demandeur position. I think, fifth, the safeguarding of the long-term sustainability of the social security system needs to be tackled very quickly, without any unacceptable burdening of the future generations. The longer one waits, the more difficult the task becomes. Sixth, the attacks to the flexibility of labour markets and the free movement of labour must be fought back. Seventh, the trust of our neighbours in that Switzerland does not want to profit from tax evasion from our neighbours must be rebuilt in a credible way. Eighth, the discipline in fiscal policy must not be relaxed. And ninth, our cosmopolitan and solidary open foreign policy must be maintained.
He painted the picture. I thought I'd been pretty thorough doing my preparations for this, but I knew I could rely on Kaspar Villiger to cover all the bases, and he really did. As I say, we've had a great introduction to Switzerland's strengths, to where Switzerland stands, but also, obviously, indirectly, to some of the challenges and some of the threats. And that's clearly the way I'd like our discussion to start moving. But first of all, before we start focusing, I'm going to ask on Jean-Pierre Danthine and Rolf Soiron briefly to respond. Ladies and gentlemen, you may all know, but maybe you don't, that the deputy head of the Swiss National Bank is in fact half Belgian, and that the chairman of Holcim, Lonza, Avenir Suisse, and many others is a Belgian import at the age of 12? 8. So they're Swiss, but they're Swiss with a little bit of distance. And I think I'd like them just, if they would be so kind as to respond initially to this idea that the image of Switzerland, the chocolate box, how accurate the chocolate box is, where maybe that box has got some fraying at the edges. Jean-Pierre.
Okay, this was a very, very broad introduction. It's difficult to be specific on this. I think maybe what I would like to say as an introduction is, of course, that the safe haven and Switzerland, whether Switzerland will play the role as a safe haven is very much depending on what's happening outside. You need a safe haven only if there is a storm. If there is a storm and there is only one small safe haven, then everybody is going to crowd into that haven, and that's going to be very difficult, which is the situation at the moment. So before we get into really all the points that have been mentioned, I would like to to suggest that we have to hope that Switzerland is increasingly less lonely as a safe haven, that there is more support, and which means adoption of many of the good policies that Kaspar Villiger has been mentioning by other countries as well. I think it's not us against the others. That's a positive of economics, is that the tides may be rising for everyone. It's not like we are suffering, if the other becomes better or more competitive. So I would like to maybe to emphasize that as a start, that being the only one who are right in a very big world is going to be creating a lot of problem for us. It is kind of the situation we are in at the moment, in the middle of the European Union, which is suffering. And I think many of the good policies that, and we can discuss maybe them, I don't know if we have the time to go through the whole list, that have been, that are promoted by Kaspar Villiger for Switzerland, should actually be proposed for the whole wide world in many ways, so that the situation is better for all of us in and outside the safe haven.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm going to come back, if I may, to one or two of those themes in a second, especially this idea of all being in the same boat, but I'm not sure. We'll see. Rolf.
The expression safe haven has, when you hear it, a very positive connotation. I belong to real industries, which over the last couple of years had sometimes the impression that being a safe haven was not only a positive thing, we were paying a high price for it. The appreciation of the Swiss franc has put considerable parts of the economy of this country under huge pressure, and we are extremely grateful to the National Bank that in September 2011 they put a ceiling or a floor, from whatever side you look at it, to that situation, and we are really dependent on you continuing on that line, perhaps even strengthening it. But there is a second connotation to the term of safety. Safety has become, in the consciousness of this country, and though I'm an import, as Haig so friendly told you, I've become, like all the secondos, a more convinced Swiss. You can hear it when you listen to my accent. There is in this country a connotation to safety, which must not be underestimated. This is a resistance to change. It is a resistance to risk-taking, particularly also in the real world of jobs, work, etc. You don't see all the scars under the makeup I currently have, but with one of the companies I'm working with, we are in a major restructuring process, which does also entail considerable job losses. We do this not lightheartedly, you can be sure, but it is a major uphill battle. And this is something which has also to do with a new tone in the orchestration of this country, that things will not always go upwards. They will also at a certain moment go sideways or even down. And there is a third connotation to the term safety. It is a tendency of the political apparatus to try to tell its constituency that they may be in a position to create safety. You know, we will have, and we may discuss this sooner or later, we will have major job losses in this country if we look what's going to happen to the financial industry. There will be job cut. And I think we should be very careful in this country to compensate for those job losses with any kind of industrial policy. You may say this is far away in Switzerland. I'm not so sure it is totally far away if you listen to the political discourse. When you really listen to the topic of the clean tech industry, etc., you see that there are also tendencies of creating type of industrial policies by government intervention, by government subsidies, etc., which are contrary to what the fabric of this country is. The fabric of this country is creativity. It is the possibility also to go wrong, but not to be supported by the government in creating industries which are successful. This tendency to preserve safety artificially from the political center, as Kaspar Villiger said it, can also be read when you look at the debate about the improving of governance. You can look at it when you look at the future energy mix, etc., which are also type of promises which are probably against the recipe of success this country had been riding over the last 50 years.
So, already, ladies and gentlemen, in our first 20 minutes, not even 25 minutes, we've touched on pretty much the most important themes that I hope we're going to be able to discuss more profoundly in the time ahead. We've talked inevitably about the exchange rate, we've talked about taxation, we've talked about regulation, we've talked about the role of the financial sector, we've talked about the role of industry, we've talked about social and political cohesion. Put those one side just for one moment, because I want to do one more big picture question before we then start looking at those one by one. And this is to the three of you. The image of Switzerland, which Kaspar Villiger broadly set out, the perception of Switzerland abroad, and the both of you kindly amplified. You're all three of you active in international groups at all levels. You were particularly so, both as a minister and as a banker. The two of you are very active in central banking circles or in industrial circles. When you're in these various committees, mixing obviously with non-Swiss. Rolf, when you're going to Indonesia or India and visiting a cement factory and talking not just to the managers but even to local people, as I know you do, is it your feeling that the image, the cliché image of Switzerland remains as strong as it always was? This small but ultra-secure, ultra-well-organized, ultra-safe place where everyone reasonable would aspire to come to, we've succeeded. Does that image still apply, or is it more complicated?
There is a huge difference in my perception when you go to Asia as on the one hand, or when you go to Europe on the other hand. In Asia, Singapore, Indonesia, for just naming the two, I think there is still a brand Switzerland which is at a certain extent admired. This is not the case when you go to certain parts of Berlin. And it is even not the case when you go to Brussels in each individual case. I recall very well when I got my Swiss passport at the age of 8 or 9 or 10, and when I, for the first time, went to the UK and I was standing in line, I was, in a kindly modest, hidden way, showing my Swiss passport with the Swiss cross, and I had the impression that people were admiring what I had in my hand. This is, and this was in the mid-50s, early 60s. This is gone. And we have made in Switzerland a couple of personal experience we had to get used to. It was when there was the European talk, about the Jewish fortunes in Swiss banks, about the gold. We had this experience again. I think in Switzerland we have to get used to the fact that we will not be liked and loved and admired at each instance. We have to have the courage to follow a policy which sometimes is very egotistical. Everybody is following his or her or their own interest. And we as a country have a right to follow our own policy without being admired and loved by everybody.
Kaspar Villiger, same question. When you're in Brussels, when you were leading negotiations, that red passport with the cross remains as symbolic as it used to be, or even then the red has got a little bit more faded?
As a politician, I would say we must differentiate now between different classes of target classes of people we are talking about. But the first remark, I used to say I know only one country where the reputation of Switzerland is really bad, and this is Switzerland. And sometimes I have the impression that we are criticizing ourselves much more than I met ever critics in foreign countries. My first experience is the same as Mr. Soiron said. Asia, I think our image is still top everywhere, also in governments, also in governmental circles. I had contacts in, it's a kind of paradise. I think the image is better than we deserve. In Europe, I see a split image. In the political circles, with politicians in Brussels, our image is not good. And I'm personally convinced it has to do with a certain jealousy also. How can it be that the country does well, which is not a member of us? I think, of course, these tax discussions and so on. But in contrast to that, if I travel in Germany very often, I meet normal people. There I meet the same feeling. Swiss, you have it better, you are freer, we would be there. Not only vacation. I think that beyond normal people throughout Europe, our image is still quite good. But the higher you come in politics, the more critics you see. And I think some of the events of the last years, of course, created some damage. I was involved in all of them in a way, not as originator, unfortunately. The Swissair crisis, then the UBS crisis, also you mentioned it, World War, I mentioned it in the beginning. I think all this, but my perception was that there was a certain, what's that in your language, Schadenfreude, a certain...
Yeah, it's Schadenfreude in my
language. A certain Schadenfreude, but also a certain comprehension that said, now you are a normal country like we.
And that's the question, Jean-Pierre, I'm going to now pass to you. Same thing, but perhaps just a little bit, and you'll see why I'm trying to focus, because the next question is going to be the real killer. When you're in Basel at the BIS, or in various international meetings, trying to explain Switzerland's position, Switzerland's dilemma in the last year and a half, one could even say, the dilemma of success, a victim of its own success. Do you feel that there's comprehension for Switzerland, or is it actually tinged by Schadenfreude, envy, a sense that, haha, now you guys are seeing what it's really like? I mean, what do you pick up when you go to those meetings?
I think in the recent times we have been able to explain the situation of Switzerland as a result of recently positive, favorable policies. We have talked about good fiscal policy, the Schuldensbremse, the debt break rule, good monetary policy, and all along good public policies. But I think it's also useful to explain that it has not always been so. And I would like to repeat that the 90s was by and large a lost decade for Switzerland. We reached the level of GDP of 1990 only in 1998. And at the time, it was very much the talk of Eurosclerosis. Now you talk about Euro crisis, but at the time was Eurosclerosis. But it was very much something like a Swiss sclerosis. And of course, I think it's useful to explain that it's not all given. We have had a lost decade. We have taken the right measures, including openness, including fiscal discipline, and we have come out of it. And so I suppose that is relatively positive to explain because it shows a way for others. This being said, maybe last word on image, I think my perception is that the Swiss quality is still very much there when it comes to product, and I think it's a big asset and it's something we have to maintain. We cannot hope to have the standard of living that we have without producing extremely good products, and we have to maintain that. But, and this is my way of making sure that Rolf knows I'm Swiss as well, there is a saying in Pays de Vaud which says, it used to be, il n'y en a point comme nous. There's no one like us. Well, this was very popular in the 80s before it generated a lot of complacency and a situation which was really preceded the fall. The Canton de Vaud in particular was in very bad shape in the 90s, and I think it was a bit the result of this complacency. Il n'y en a point comme nous. So a good image is good, but we have to be
May I add, Mr. Delamura he used to say, les Suisses se lèvent tôt et se réveillent tard.
Exactly.
Jean-Pierre, stay on the ball, because I want to now start moving towards the challenges. And you're unfortunately in that hot seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I did a panel just last week, and we had as one of the guests Wolfgang Franz. I don't know if it's a name known to many here. He's the chairman of the German Sachverständigenrat, the Council of Economic Advisors, a very competent, very well-regarded economist. And he said, please, whatever you do, don't ask me about market-related things. Whenever anyone asks me in Germany about where I see the euro, I say very simply, best in my pocket. So it's his joke, not mine, but I thought it was like Jean-Pierre, I'm not going to be so naive as to ask you about the future exchange rate, but you can tell me if you like. But you mentioned that the 90s were in many ways a lost decade for Switzerland because Switzerland made some mistakes, and you will be able to offer insights on the politics of that decade if we want to have a historischer Rückblick. But it's true that Switzerland probably did need to be woken up, and okay, the housing crisis was homemade, but markets were closed, Switzerland was closed, immigration, you name it, you know it better than me. You could argue that the potential crisis now, though, is not a crisis of Switzerland's making, it's a crisis sadly outside Switzerland's control, because what's happening is happening in the Eurozone and happening in the wider world economy, and Switzerland is trying bravely, so far reasonably successfully, to fight against it. You, 14 months ago, introduced the minimum exchange rate, the floor, and it has been, to my surprise, amazingly successful. You've built up huge reserves, but the thing has held, and Rolf Soiron has already given us, I mean, I thought a very heartfelt view from industry, where he'd even like it to go in future. But, I mean, here's a major challenge for this safe harbor. How long can you keep this up?
Well, as long as it's needed. As you say,
I can't let you say in your pocket, you know.
It's a major challenge. We are absolutely convinced that it was the right decision, not only because it pleases Rolf Soiron and other industrialists, but because it promotes the right monetary condition in a very difficult period for Switzerland. So we, in a sense, I say we can keep it as long as needed. But we certainly hope that the world becomes a better place, including in the neighboring European countries, and that this role that we have been playing as safe haven will not be needed. So that's the other way. It's good to be potentially a safe haven, but it's even better when the situation in the world is such that it is not needed. And so if you think about the current economic forecast, they call for a slight amelioration, certainly outside, everywhere in Asia, in the United States. If the European Union can take advantage of that to turn around and get into a phase of improved policies, improve good structural decisions, and a little improved also conjunctural macroeconomic conditions, then the safe haven characteristic of the Swiss economy will be less needed, and that's what we are hoping for.
Rolf, as an industrialist, you've praised the central bank for having taken the bold step. You've indicated you'd like it to be even a little bit bolder, but it can't make you feel comfortable when you're doing your budgeting and your planning, really, to have such an imponderable when it comes to the exchange rate. I mean, what would you really like them to do?
To continue. To continue. You know, you say you cannot like it to have an imponderable. I think that's life. We are not in a centrally planned life. We are in a life where we have imponderables. And that's an imponderable we have to live with. I think the only thing we can do, without having a crystal ball, without being in a position to forecast what's really going to happen, we can avoid to put more weight or more liabilities or more wrong things on our plate. And I do repeat what I think we are currently on the way of doing wrong. Instead of putting all our energy in finding a more liberalized energy system which brings our energy prices in line with the European system. We are building now dreams of, at the end of the day, regulated energy mixes, which are going to be an additional burden on the producing industry's income statement. Second thing, we do risk to make our governance system, which used to be a flexible system, extremely liberal in the good sense of the word, to become an ethically driven system where we already now know that it is not going to deliver the results it wants, etc., etc. We are even going to put an industry, a new industry in question, which is going to find this country as a position for working in a successful way the trades with the trading houses for raw materials, etc. We start now a political discourse of regulating them in the same manner we started to regulate, we tried to regulate the financial industry. I think this is what the political responsibility of the political class, us included in this country, is. It is not to increase the burden of centralized rules because they take responsibilities away from us. We then have to live with the imponderables, and we have not done that badly over the last 20 years.
I'm not sure if we're going to have enough time, considering the ground we've got to cover, to get into energy policy. That may be another future UBS Centre debate. But I do want to talk about regulation, and I do want to talk about tax. Kaspar, Villiger, will you set the ball rolling on those two next challenges, at least on my list? Let's talk tax a second. I mean, Switzerland, you referred to, has had a beneficial situation. It's been an important factor in the economic success, having this very competitive tax system. But obviously it's a tax system which is also under threat, domestically, because not everyone is in agreement, and externally, because, as you know, some people feel it's unfair, whether correctly or not, but the pressures are there. Is this something that's sustainable?
I see two elements in this tax question. One element is that a lot of people do not like that we have tax competition, that we have low taxes. But this is something that is, I think, for a sustainable development of an economy, something very important. And if we have moderate taxes, I think that's not political wisdom. That is only a very simple fact. That's the consequence of the competition between cantons. Because this competition forces the cantons to have a price-performance ratio like a private enterprise, private company, and if they don't have that, they lose. The people vote with their feet. And I think here we should not, of course, if other people, if other countries compete with that, that's like between the cantons, that of course they try everything to destroy this competitive advantage of Switzerland, that I understand, but here I think we have to do everything to maintain this situation. The other element is the area of taxation where there are some reasons that other countries criticize us. And of course I think you think certainly on the banking secrecy. And the bank secrecy was in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s very strong. And then Switzerland realized that, and I would say at that time, tax evasion was still a bit a gentleman's delict, because we had a lot of countries with very high taxes, not very democratic, legitimated taxes, and so on. And it was a kind of human right to bring some money into Switzerland, other unstable. But then I think we saw that from year to year that this bank secrecy in this strict form could be abused. And that's the reason why this bank secrecy was step by step within the last 20 years adapted. Also during my time as Minister of Finance, we did a lot of work. For instance, we introduced the Anti-Money Laundering Act. We introduced the insider issues. I negotiated with Bolkestein the first savings agreement with the European Union, which gave at least some of the taxes, unjustified taxes, Switzerland back, and so on. And in the meantime, of course, I think tax evasion is not anymore accepted morally, and I share this view. I had this view always, also as a Minister of Finance. I always said, if you don't pay your taxes, I know you do, but if you wouldn't, I have to pay more, and this is not just. Our system, I think we have less tax evasion than other countries, but I think we have quite enough. I think the Swiss system was based on trust. The people can vote for their taxes, then they have more legitimation, and if they are not too high, they are better willing to pay them. All that might change a little bit, and now under pressure, I think, and the savings directive of the savings treaty with the European Union was a beginning. I think this develops, and I support that. And I think what is now going on now would be a good solution for Switzerland. I do not want to go too long. You might.
We're going to come back to this. Don't worry.
We come back to this, and then I might say abolition tax, and what in the case that Germany says no, and so on. We can come back on that. But basically, I think we have to do something that for our reputation and because it's fair that we find solutions with our neighbours.
Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who know me know that no panel will finish with me involved before we talk about bank secrecy. So that's coming, don't worry. Rolf, talk about tax a second from an industrialist point of view. You feel Switzerland is under threat? You think that the situation is unstable, or actually things are pretty good?
I represent two industries which do not complain because we get our arms around any tax official so far. One of them is in the canton of Wallis, and there, you know, they look after you. Now, but having said this, there is one serious element I think we need. If you look at the absolute rates, then Switzerland is even not in the driving seat. Switzerland does not have the best tax rates at all. But there are two things which are, if I compare it to other jurisdictions in Europe, but particularly in Asia, which are different. A, you can, and now I don't want to say it jokingly, you can talk to your tax inspector. You can explain what happens, and you can strike reasonable deals. They have to be reasonable on both sides. That's an extremely important advantage here. And the second element, they are predictable. And I think these are the two elements which are still very much in our favor here. It is the predictability, and it is the possibility to dialogue. And that's very, very different to compare it with many, many other jurisdictions.
Thank you. Jean-Pierre, I'm coming back to you now, not on tax, but on the next list of my little challenges. Regulation. Can there be dialogue also over regulation? The Too Big to Fail committee involved representatives of the banking sector as well as the National Bank and FINMA. There seemed to be some backwards and forwards, but in the end, Switzerland came out with some of the toughest, if not the very toughest, capital standards for its banking sector. Is regulation a plus for Switzerland as a safe harbour, or is it actually a minus because it's a risk?
Well, I was going to say something on tax, but it's the same line. It's the same line. And the same line is, when you think about taxes, taxes are needed, but we need an efficient public sector. And in general, we have it in Switzerland, but it's never to be taken for granted. We need to have an efficient tax system, which should be adapted to the international environment, what is acceptable. And I think what's the word I wanted to highlight, which was already used by Rolf, was reasonable. Things have to be reasonable. We have to think about efficiency in the public sector, efficiency in the tax system, by good discussion between all parties, evacuating ideology and going for a reason. I think it's the same thing for regulation. I mean, we certainly need regulation. Purely unfettered market system will not work, particularly in finance, but in other domains as well. And so we need regulation. We certainly, I think nobody would object to the statement that capital regulations were excessively loose. We got carried away a little bit. I'm talking about BIS, Basel II, etc. Now we are coming to more reasonable capital requirements. We have done so very quickly in Switzerland because, of course, we are in a very special situation with two very, very large banks compared to the size of the economy. We escaped narrowly, something that could have been dramatic for the country. We are coming ahead, I would say we are coming out rather ahead of the UBS episode, but we should make sure that this is not going to be repeated. And I think we are getting at it with a reason, and the proof of it is that when we talk to Credit Suisse and UBS today, I think they largely accept the fact that this too big to fail package was a reasonable package and is going to be an asset for them, a comparative advantage for them in the future.
Well, the relationship with Credit Suisse seemed to have some rockier elements in it earlier this year, but we won't go down that road right now. I don't think so, anyway. I didn't ask you about tax because I thought it would be a bit too close to government issues, but let's keep with regulation. A first mover advantage for Switzerland? I mean, that Switzerland can set a pace and set a level for its banks, especially because of their importance in terms of the national economy? Or as some of the bankers at least claimed, a first mover disadvantage? When did it come out?
It's an old tradition in Switzerland that we believe we are the best and the first, and everybody will copy us in the good things.
But the worst, of course, is to be the first and then not be copied by everyone.
Let me first make a short consideration on my experience with regulation. I have a lot of experience. I was a regulator as Minister of Finance, and in the UBS I had to suffer what I have regulated before. And this is a fantastic experience. I hope that other colleagues or finance ministers can make that one day. Now, one of my experiences is that very often, or I wouldn't say in 50%, but very often, regulation has totally different effects and results than the politicians have thought before. Because regulation changes the incentives of people, and people follow incentives. And the politicians think, if I want that you do that, I tell you, put the law, do that, and I do not think that you might find another solution and do nothing and something very different. And I read once, a couple of years ago, a fantastic book by an economist, Horst Sieber from Germany, who the title is The Cobra Effect. And the story is very interesting because it corresponds to my regulation experience. The Vice King, or what's you're British, what was the Vizekönig in India? What was
Viceroy.
Yeah, the Viceroy in India. Got complaints that there are too many cobras, and cobras have been a plague in the country. Everybody complained about cobras. And then he said, I pay per head of cobra, I pay a certain sum that people have an incentive to bring me, to kill them and bring to me. A year later, the mass of cobras has doubled. Why? Because the people began to breed cobras to have the heads to bring in. Now that's, and that is... That can happen with regulation. And the Minister of Defense, I saw that armies are always preparing the last war and not the next one. And I fear a little bit that this happens also in such a crisis. But coming now to your precise question on Switzerland, we always, you might remember that UBS was a bit more critical about the planned regulation before, with one argument which now shows that this argument has a certain importance. He said, if other countries do not follow and the distance from Switzerland to others is too big, that can create a competitive disadvantage which could create damage also for the financial center in Switzerland. On the other hand, we from the beginning on realized that the capital problem was a serious problem. And when I look back what capital in the beginning of the crisis, or the ratio between capital, the leverage ratio of UBS was, I didn't realize that before the crisis came. I wouldn't have slept well, really knowing it. And I think UBS proved that they accepted this capital, this capital need with dem Tatbeweis within the last 3 years. I think we really could double the capitalization ratios and all that. I think we tried to do a good job. And for me, this capital issue, because it's a very simple measure, it gives more solidity. It doesn't make a bankrupt impossible or a crisis, but it reduces significantly the likelihood of it. I think this is a good thing. But what one can see now is that the Americans, for instance, do everything to do what is in their own interest. They now postponed even Basel III. And I think this can create some problems for some banks of us. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that the American banks will have a big profit out of that, what now happens in Europe. But the direction, and the last remark, what I found very positive, you never said you must make this and another structure. You said we make the framework in a way that you have the incentive to do the right things, and that gives much more liberty to the banks to create their own and to look for their best structure, and I think this was a good thing. Basically, some concerns, but basically good job, and also the predictability that we know now in Switzerland what comes is better than in other countries. That means, I think, good job.
Rolf, I know you want to come in on this, but if I can summarize that, if I got it right, it might be best to be first, it might not be best to be first, but it certainly helps to be the US.
Yeah. We'll use that in the next panel.
I happen to be on that select government committee which set up the too big to fail rules. And my memory is the following. I found it very interesting how this process went. And one has just to state that UBS and Credit Suisse were also in that committee. This was finding a practical compromise. And the rules for the compromise were, it has to be a simple rule, it cannot be overdone, it has to be timing-wise orchestrated in a way that it can be done in a practical way. And as far as the tools, CCs and so are concerned, there has to be a flexibility that the banks can respond to what the opportunities and the threats of the moment are. And at the end, we had a package which was signed on by everybody. It was signed on by the National Bank, it was signed on by the Finance Ministry, and it was signed on by the financial industry themselves. I found this, in terms of how things can be crafted, almost a textbook case. Second observation, Haig, I think it would be wrong to say that this country is overregulated. It is not. But, and that's the third point, we have to keep that equilibrium. We have not to put more weight on our wagon, because otherwise the wagon would get out of this equilibrium. And out of a current debate, everybody knows in this room who participates in the current debates in this country, the current debate on governance, corporate governance, is going the wrong way. That we suddenly should have in the Constitution's rules that for quoted companies we have every year a re-election is stupidity. These are things shareholders should be in a position to rule themselves, etc. And there we have, when you follow the public debate, we have a tendency in this country which I do not particularly like, because there seems to be a large current in our public opinion which does not dislike, as much as I do, central regulations of things like that.
Are you suggesting that there's actually been a change in Swiss society, because this used to be known as a society which was actually very, very open in that respect?
There is a change. I'm not totally desperate when I see how now even Travail Suisse, a confederation of trade unions, etc., starts to think twice, perhaps even start to think a third time. It might be that there is going to be a kind of a wake-up call before next March. What do I know? But currently, and certainly if I follow the debate which has taken place over the last 12 or 24 months, I do say an increasing pleasure on regulating things which a traditional Swiss opinion in the past would certainly have shied away from.
Can I ask a question on that, maybe? Is this more than a very specific issue which has to do with bonuses? Because if you think about yes, in Switzerland we often go to the people, and the people also are often very reasonable. Remember the vote last year on the 6 weeks vacation, which was refused, which was turned down by the people. But then I wonder, of course, the issue of bonuses has taken such big proportions, such emotional value everywhere, not only in Switzerland, that it is a lot to ask for reasons to prevail on that particular issue.
It seems to me we could argue this two ways, obviously, because we could argue that curbing bonuses is a good and not curbing bonuses is a good. One could, of course, as Kaspar Villiger was suggesting, in terms of first mover, that giving the people the right to express their opinions shows how advanced Switzerland is compared with many of its neighbour countries, because, as you rightly say, this is an issue which is of great relevance and of great populist relevance everywhere at the moment. Let's not go down that road quite now, though. Perhaps we should try and stick a bit more to the agenda, but a fascinating theme. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I want to allow plenty of time for question and answers, but we have so much more ground to cover, and it's always a danger as a moderator trying to race ahead, but we need to try and keep going ahead. Can we talk a little bit about Swiss politics? And that could keep us going a long time as well. It's a system, Kaspar Villiger, you know very well, renowned for stability, renowned for consensus, renowned for the quality of its decision-making. But a series of crises, bank secrecy is obviously one of the most obvious for the financial community, but not the only one, seems to have brought that system to a testing point, and many have suggested that the system has not always adequately coped. Now, I know it's always dangerous to make predictions too soon. I don't know how many of you remember, I certainly do, writing sarcastically about Colonel Gaddafi taunting Switzerland and poor old Max Göldi stuck in the Swiss embassy or a Libyan jail. And in retrospect, not that many months later, Max Göldi, I hope, is enjoying a very welcome retirement or early retirement somewhere in Switzerland, and we all know what happened to Colonel Gaddafi. So perhaps it's too dangerous to be short-sighted. But the Swiss system did seem, in that instance, and I think in the bank secrecy instance too, to have not been entirely adequate at coping, not have been able to address crises fast enough. This is your territory.
Yeah, I think the Swiss system is in a way a slow system. And a slow system has advantages and disadvantages. One advantage is if you don't decide too fast, you see that the decision in other countries was a flop, and then you can avoid it. If you are too fast, you might make mistakes. And if I now compare the different systems, one must see that the Swiss system is slow with two houses with equal rights, with a government in consensus, with votes and so on. On the other hand, it has a lot of advantages. You see that a lot of other countries think that they should use some plebiscitarian elements, some direct democracy elements to have a better legitimation for political decisions, like the Stuttgarter Bahnhof or whatever. I think if democracy is in a crisis everywhere, and if you look now where is the financial situation better? Where the Swiss people had to vote for the Schuldenbremse, and they voted with 85%, yes, which is a fantastic result. Sometimes the people are more intelligent than their politicians, and I think all this shows that this system, for the really basic problems until now, I don't know the future, has worked quite well. On the other hand, you see that other systems, which theoretically are very efficient, let's say an American president and so on, and then or a concurrent system, competition between Party A and Party B, British system, you see that this doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work either. They have to introduce elements of what we call concordance. The President of the United States has to deal with the Republican Congress. Not the Senate. The British have to, the Conservatives need a new party. Was not thinkable years ago. In Germany, the Bundesrat, where the green and red are stronger than the other, can block a decision in a competitive system. That shows that that it's not the system itself, but the complexity of what happens here makes democracy more difficult. And on the long run, I'm a strong believer that the Swiss system will be capable to solve the problems. And if it really needs to be decided fast. For instance, too big to fail. I think they did that in a time which is faster than democracies, which pretend to be more effective. We have other experiments. For instance, I remember the bilaterale Verträge, record tempo in the two houses in Switzerland. I think if the Swiss politicians and the people see that something is urgent, they are able, or Swissair crisis, or UBS crisis, a lot of critics, noise afterwards, everybody says it was wrong and so on, but the problem was solved. I think here I'm not so pessimistic, but not thinking that we could not do this and others better.
I mean, the UBS crisis, we're not allowed to call it a bailout. We had endless conversations. But the intervention that took place, obviously, during that episode happened very fast, and surprisingly fast, I think, for those who had tended to criticize the Swiss system. Jean-Pierre, I mean, for you, the Swiss political system as it is, and I know this is probably slightly dangerous ground, is an advantage in the sense that it makes the independence of the central bank that much stronger because there isn't an overbearing government breathing down your necks, or it doesn't really make a lot of difference. Many would say, with the intervention of last year, you actually filled a vacuum because the political system didn't actually do its job.
No, I would not say that. I think it was the appropriate reaction given the circumstances, and it was independent of the strength of inequalities of the political system. I think the reaction of the political system in the crisis was excellent, given the nature of the crisis. So, no, I think it's very important to have an independent central bank, but this is possible, and we can see it in a variety of economic systems, some that are more centralized and stronger, and that are more decentralized. So I think that's all I want to say on that topic, but Rolf would like to talk.
Prof, you have some views here, I know.
I don't think that the system is really slow. I joined Kaspar Villiger. When you look at a couple of experiences lately, the new financial equalization system between the cantons, neuer Finanzausgleich, when you look at the constitutional break against excess and continuous deficits, the Schuldenbremse, when you look at the revitalization Jean-Pierre mentioned of the Swiss economy in total, the 90s were a lost decade and then suddenly it took off, etc. So there are really complex projects which this system is capable of tackling. I have concerns which go beyond the system. It is the underlying forces. Number one is the decline of the center in this country. That's something which really concerns me, and it could be historical. When you look at one of the constituting elements of the middle, the Christian Democrats, which de facto are a Catholic party, they have lost their historical mission since the early 70s. I mean, they are going to put me probably on the index when I say this, but the relevance of the Pope's index is anyway limited in the meantime. But this breakdown of the middle is an issue, and with all due respect, Kaspar Villiger, historically your party is not exactly on an upward run neither. So what is going to happen if this center breaks apart? Second element, it is a fragmentation of values. And when I talk about values, I'm not talking about moralistic ones. Jokingly, I said in the beginning, I'm one of the very few real economy representatives in this room. But we should not underestimate that there is a kind of a distance which have taken place in this country between the representatives of the real economy and the representatives of the financial industry. There is a kind of a blame. Are we the victims or are we the constituency? What is the narrative of this? This is actually a topic, I think, which the economical theory and science should also deal with. It is the narrative and the place the real economy plays within this larger framework. And the last concern regarding the political system is the question of the cantons. We will have to deal with a major infrastructure challenge in this country in view of the demographic development ahead of us. It will be very difficult to solve this major infrastructure modernization again and adaptation if we continue to do it in this cantonal patchwork we currently have. There are many proposals actually also coming from the University of Zurich how a new vision could look like, and I am not a visionary who draws maps how the country looks like, but the only thing I say, if we have a challenge, it is not on the federal system, it is on the infrastructural system and how the cantons in the federalism work most efficiently together.
Okay. Let me do one more round before we open it up. There's so many themes here, and we've already got fantastic food for thought for questions. But I'd like to do one more round on politics again, on external challenges to all three of you. Whether it's differences with Brussels over bank secrecy and tax harmonization, whether it's over corporate tax and treatment of foreign holding companies, or whether it's possible relations between Bern and maybe in a year's time red-green government under Chancellor Steinbrück in Berlin with Claudia Rother's, I don't know what, minister and various other luminaries. I mean, this seems to me a relationship, a scenario which could pose extremely serious challenges for Switzerland. Forget about what's happening in terms of relationships with the US, whether the whole bank secrecy issue has gone away because a solution has been found, or more likely, yet another Swiss bank is facing imminent indictment and a last-minute solution has to be patched up. I mean, it seems to me potentially a real nightmare scenario. Can Switzerland cope?
Yeah, I think in a very complex world, a small country with only 7 million, I said, size of a Chinese city, with 7 million people has limited resources. And this is also specialist. I think that's why we developed mechanisms. For instance, years ago, the Bankenkommission. We had very good people there, practitioners. They had to go 30% of the time in den Ausstand because they had their own interests in it. We have not the potential to do everything ideally, and depending, of course, what will come in the future, we can really come to limits where a small country like we cannot do everything itself. And then, of course, when I said I prefer to be outside of the European Union, but we need good relations, we have to be friends. I always say we are a kind of Sonderwirtschaftszone, or they don't like us always, but I can from time to time learn something. But I think we have the same values, we have the same, I think we live together. And we have to try to be more friends again. I think these problems we have now, taxation and so on, that's a bit also window speaking. I think today the Brussels commissioner makes a press conference. I was strong with Switzerland. I know that when I negotiated with Bolkestein and compared that what he said on the television, it was quite different. I think the relations are not bad, but they have been certainly better a certain time ago. And we have to learn, or we had to learn, that these relations are important, not only in the tax sector, also in other sectors. And I think, for instance, the foreign minister, when I came to the Federal Council, the foreign minister was a bit second class. Maybe not yet, maybe 20 years before. Not so important. Where put him, let him do the foreign. It's more important the finance or other things. This has changed dramatically. I think everything we have to maybe to find a better way to defend our interests efficiently in the capitals of Europe, and that might need some changements also in the structure or with Staatssekretär or whatever. I think we had to learn as Switzerland, that's my last remark, we are not an island. I said in my introductory statement that we can only be wealthy when we can exchange goods and services with others. That means our wealth depends from others. And that's why what you said in the beginning, we have an interest that others have a good economy and so on. And I think this interdependence, we had to learn that what happens in Japan can have an influence on our jobs, and I think here a part at least of our population could learn a little bit more.
Jean-Pierre, I'll try and phrase it as broadly as I can, given the difficulties for you. Is the safe harbour sufficiently protected, do you believe, against the potential storms ahead, some of which I've mentioned, and goodness knows how many I don't even know about and can't imagine? Can that safe harbour be further improved from your point of view?
Well, I think it's the fact that being a small country in a world of big players is not comfortable. And it's not obvious today what is the equilibrium here. We had the Swiss Bankers Association at the 100th anniversary, or 100th anniversary on Friday. And it was so obvious there that being Luxembourg in the middle of Europe is not very comfortable either. Okay, so being small in any case is not comfortable. One suggestion, and maybe that I would relay, which is precisely the proposal that was made on Friday, to have a platform, a common platform for small open financial centers. And the idea, I guess, is, well, maybe those small countries which are facing similar type of problem all over the world can get together and discuss ways to improve their handling or negotiating position in this uncomfortable world.
It certainly sounds like a good idea as long as the rivalries can be overcome. Rolf, to close before we open the floor to the panel, the safe harbour?
I think we should avoid the analogy of the safe harbour becoming a picture of a intended safe fortress. This leads to a second observation. We have a couple of priorities where we have really to focus on, one being actually the energy trade agreement with the European Union. We need this. Actually, the European Union also needs it. But there we have to be creative as far as the critical points are concerned. And this leads me to a third topic, which is not extremely popular in some circles in this country. We need to find a way how to speak with the European Union. It cannot be 100% position to our liking. This question of what of the acquis communautaire has to be accepted and what not has to be addressed in a way which preserves our interest. But it can not only preserve our interest. I'm certainly not an advocate of joining the Union at all. But I say in these relations, the next couple of years have to find answers because we cannot live in isolation. Europe is a fact, particularly for the industry. 2/3 of our exports and of our direct investments go into this part of the world. Europe is not on an uphill way neither, but they will remain our next neighbors, and we have to find operating ways how to work with them.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we've covered a fantastic amount of ground in 75 minutes. On the other hand, I see just from my little pad, we haven't talked about really the future of the financial sector in immense depth, let alone the two big banks. We haven't talked about big societal issues, immigration as well. We haven't talked about values, we've mentioned them, but a fragmentation of values. We haven't talked about competition between financial centres. I'm astonished the word London has not yet been mentioned, but maybe it will be. We've mentioned protectionism, but we haven't gone in any depth. And those are just 5 themes. So we have about 15 minutes, maybe 20 if I'm naughty and let it run on, to have some questions, assuming there are any. Otherwise, I think we can keep things going for the next hour or 3. But the floor really is yours. The only thing is, please, stick up a hand, stand up if you have to. It's hard to see right at the very back. And tell us, if you'd be so kind, who you are and your affiliation before you put your question. Silence. One question. Please go ahead.
So this is Hannes Krasinger, journalist for Südostschweiz. Mr. Villiger, just could you give us some details about your idea of the state secretaries you were mentioning before? And a second question to Monsieur Soiron. You were talking about kind of a war situation between real economy and financial economy. Could you give us more details about this too? Thank you.
He's a fellow journalist looking for some good quotes.
Yeah.
I hope you'll oblige.
Yeah, in a way, I'm here because I'm chairman of the UBS Foundation for Economics in Society. I have no more public function, and I made a promise to my wife and to myself. I do not want to talk too much about politics in Switzerland, especially not criticize my successors. But here I think I can, because you can read it in a book that I wrote and nobody reads. The question is an old question: is the Swiss system with 7 ministers able to work together in the future? And you know, there is a new discussion: should we have 9? Should we have 11? There was the saying that 7 Swiss cannot be more intelligent than 25 Austrians, and so on. And if I look at the system, for me, I was always convinced that 7 is the maximum we should do. Because if you, I say it a little bit theoretically, if you have a system of different elements, if you increase the amount of elements linearly, the complexity increases over proportional, or exponentially. And if you have 9 or 11 ministers on the same level, that's the condition, on the same level, then you begin to have Fraktionen, you have pre-discussions and so on, and you have no more really the possibility to discuss the real issues. And that's why I think 7 is the maximum that from the group dynamics is workable, and 7 is the minimum for having a certain representation of different groups in Switzerland. That means 7 is a holy number. It's a fantastic figure. But of course there is more work. Of course there is more complexity. Of course, should every federal council go to every meeting of every committee, also if it's only routine and so on? Already today it's possible to have replacements under certain conditions. And we had once, but the Swiss people said no, because the SVP fighted against it, a model which was not so bad, with Staatssekretären, with more competencies. We have a certain political function, can make visits in other capitals, can maybe even talk once for simple things in front of the parliament, things like that. And I think then you have, in a way, you can keep collegiality, which is a good Swiss system. We don't want to have too strong figures, and I think to have maybe 1 year is not very much for a president, but after 1 year I was always glad that I can stop it, because I had my department beside and so on. I think this is a different culture also reflecting a bit our Swiss. And I think it is possible, without abandoning this culture, to have structural and organizational measures to make a little bit better. But basically I would keep the system alive.
Rolf, industry fights back?
I didn't use the word war. I spoke about the distance. And I would like to share the following observations with you. First of all, the word real economy. When I look at my diary notes, I use the word real economy since 2007. I'm 67 years old. Before I became so mature and wise to be 60, I never used the word real economy. It is something new. Second observation, in this real economy, you know, those who make chemicals, cement, machines, and so, there is a sentiment that we have been paying the price for some of the problems of the last couple of years. The price being, you know, a financial system which grew, the bonuses, the exaggerations, the huge exuberance, for using Greenspan's words, etc. So we pay the price is a feeling. I do not say it's a truth. I say it's a feeling. Third observation. There is a feeling in the real economy that, and this is probably a fact, the financial industry and the financial system has emancipated itself and has become an entity on its own, and it has lost what my people say was the origin of the financial system. This was an enabler for the real economy. Now this enabler has become, you know, a giant sailing on its own orbit. And the fourth observation is a very anecdotal one, but those of my age probably will know this and will share it. In the 80s, you had on all respectable Swiss industry boards, you had a banker. You will not see a banker anymore on any Swiss respectable industry board. And you see, even the joke is finding a couple of laughs. And I think this is an anecdotal observation which leads to points that, you know, this Swiss system where you had everybody being friend with everybody and this friendship being represented, that institutionalized everybody, this has somewhat specialized and differentiated, but I did not use the word war.
Okay, thank you for that. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, I see a hand already in front there. Thank you. You were quick.
I have a question to Mr. Villiger. You mentioned in your list about the strengths of Switzerland, direct democracy, which increases legitimacy of political decisions and therefore acceptance in the broad population. Now, isn't there a limit to direct democracy when it comes to fundamental rights or to international treaties? And how can Switzerland cope with that in a more intertwined international community?
Can we keep the answer to less than about 3 hours? Because it's,
sure. First, I would like to say that I agreed with everything what Mr. Soiron said this evening, except this border between the financial world and the real world. I disagree. I disagree, really. I managed a real economy company during 23 years. I have a certain experience there. And I agree with you that there have been exaggerations and so on, but I think a sound financial infrastructure. And where is the border? Is an insurance? Is that real economy or not real economy? I think there are a lot of, you cannot hedging of raw material or whatever. I think they need each other, and if the world has made a lot, we always talk about this crisis, but we do not realize that we have less hunger than 50 or 60 years ago, that we have less poverty, that we have with an exploding, and this had a lot to do with new financial instruments, looking everywhere for entrepreneurs, and then of course liberalization of markets. That's why I think they belong together, but the mistakes you mentioned there, I cannot say it's not true, because I came in UBS because of things like that. But only I think we need both, and we shouldn't make a contradiction between them. Now, this is really a difficult question, but I think that here, I think Mr. Soiron said something important. He said it's not the structures that is a concern for him, but the spirit behind it, what is happening. And I think with direct democracy, I see some risks. One risk is if you look at some people's initiatives. For instance, the mass of them, more and more come, but that's not the first time that we have such a wave. We survived it. But more and more of these initiatives are not very solidly formulated, and are based on momentaneous emotions, like the Minder initiative, which has a really disadvantage. I think I can only, you said you understand a bit bonus, I understand that also, but if the Minder is accepted, I can only give advice to all my friends, never go again into a Verwaltungsrat, never do that again. You have risks you cannot control, and I think I read that the boss of, I think, KPMG Europe said that would push back Switzerland Lichtjahre. I don't go so far, but I think this is really an example of an emotional reaction. And if, of course, we have only votes with emotional reactions and no more people thinking and discussing and so on, then I would see that we run a risk. But until now, and the Minder initiative is not yet voted, until now, if I look back, I think very often I was afraid, and I said, are Swiss people, are they really able to understand that and so on? And in the evening of the vote, I said, yes, they are not so, they are good. They discuss it and have a feeling for it. And if you looked at other countries, look for possibilities like that to have more legitimation for their political decisions. I think it's not so bad, but I think also it's in a small country like ours, where we know each other, much easier than in other countries. But your question was, can that survive? Is that for the future? I think, yes, if we have politicians that have the courage to tell what they think, and if the emotions on the evening when they go to vote are a bit more down than maybe when the initiative was started.
Thank you. You could amplify this, I know, but let's see what else we can get from the floor if we have any more. I see a hand there. I'm just wondering if there's anyone at the back, because I feel I'm being very unfair to the back, but I really can't see that far. Has anyone spotted anyone in the back? We'll come to you if we may, and then we'll stop with that gentleman. So let's do a couple more.
Daniel Dennicker, I'm a lawyer in Zurich. If you compare Singapore, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland, one of the most striking things to me is that government in Singapore and the United Kingdom is extremely supportive of industry and extremely supportive of the financial sector. Media in Singapore and in the United Kingdom is fairly supportive of industry and fairly supportive of the financial sector. And in Switzerland, government is rather lukewarm about the financial sector, and media is overtly hostile. Is that something we just have to live with, or is it something we can do better?
I know you're not directing the question to me, so I'm going to recuse myself from any comment about the media, but I will let the three gentlemen who are much more interesting answer. The media. I've worked in 6 countries now, you know, and every country I've worked, I've always heard, we really admire you, Mr. Simonian, because the media in your country, the UK, is so wonderfully supportive of the City of London, and the media in our country, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, you name it, are so terrible. I just don't think it's true, but come on.
Oh, I'm not the right person to comment on that. I suspect that it's a little bit what Kaspar Villiger has been saying. I mean, the Swiss have the habit of being relatively self-critic or critical, and I think it's not a bad habit. On the other hand, it's not clear that if you read the whole of the English press, they would be much more supportive of the financial industry than our Swiss press.
Yeah, I said I promised not to criticize our authorities, and that's why I will not answer whether we have support or not. My impression is I know Singapore quite well. I think there is really a strategy to make propaganda to push the financial center. And certainly in Switzerland, in the aftermath of the UBS crisis, we at UBS had not this impression. We had the impression that the critics have been, I talk about now about authorities, are quite heavy and not useful maybe for the reaction of clients in other countries. But maybe if you are in such a trouble, then you might a little bit also overreact on such critics. Basically, I agree with you. I always said if you have a responsibility in Switzerland, I saw that as a Bundesrat, etc., you are always criticized. You have always the dogs biting here and there. And sometimes I said, must that be? And then at the end I said that is firstly maybe also a test. Do you resist or not? And secondly, you are never too happy. And if the ones who have responsibility are never too happy, it's not a bad thing, because I see other examples in other countries. That's why I survived 15 years in the government with a very happy heart. And the newspapers, of course, it's their task to criticize, and the bank made such mistakes. That's why I cannot criticize when they criticized the mistakes they made. Sometimes these critics in the tonality was maybe not what I would have dreamed. It was not always true also, but if you are once the bad guy, every element that comes out proves that you are the bad guy, and you have to live with that in the crisis.
Rolf, does the media treat the real economy better in Switzerland?
I have to apologize for what I'm going to say. I think we have a quality issue as far as the economic departments of a majority of our media is concerned. We have a quite high quality as far as the political debate is concerned. Even though some of the red threads are not to my liking, red thread was now symbolically an analogy used. I think there is still content-wise quite not only passion, there are clear positions, there are arguments, there is a lively political debate. If you look at the majority of the economical parts of our media, then I'm afraid not to be in a position to compliment in the same way. There are obvious exceptions, but the majority is not entertaining a high-quality debate.
I'm going to suggest to stop there for your own peace of mind next Sunday.
Thank you.
We should be punctual in Switzerland, and I should stop, but I'm naughty. There was one question here, I think, a gentleman. Let's just take that one, and then we'll close. There we go.
Yes, thank you. My name is Roger Köppel. I'm a journalist from Zurich. Actually,
You're the only person who's identified themselves.
The lawyer identified himself as well. By the way, not all the newspapers are so critical about the financial sector, without naming mine. There was an interesting cover story. Unfortunately, not in my magazine, but in the magazine Bilanz. And it said, it was about the salaries of the presidents of the board, Verwaltungsratspräsidente in Switzerland. Both you were not mentioned in this article, therefore I can ask the question. Yeah. And the salaries of these gentlemen are extremely high, even higher in comparison to the United States or to England, which was always kind of the role model for us, much higher. And I wanted to ask the people on the podium, do you think this is a problem, or is this just media exaggeration?
Let's phrase it to fit our event. Let's say, is it something that helps the safe haver, or is it something that harms the safe haver? You don't have a view, do you? You're not allowed to have a view.
I can have a view. I mean, it seems to me that wherever the incentive issues that you have been talking about are not a problem, which I would imagine is the case in most big firms. Maybe I'm naive on this. Then the salaries of the members of the board is a business of the shareholders. I think in the banking industry, where there was incentive problems, which have to do with a variety of issues like limited liability, extreme leverage, etc., then it can be shown that indeed there is an issue about the level of salaries, or at least the dynamics, or the dynamic structure of salaries or board member compensation. So that's what I would like to say as a private citizen.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Kaspar, I can't remember if you were paid 1 million or 2 million, which is a pretty bad mistake, and thank God I'm no longer a journalist writing in the Financial Times. Yeah. Was it 1 million you took at the beginning?
It was 850,000, and then they offered me some shares a little bit later on, but I took only 20 to 25% of what was offered to me in the beginning, because of the reasons I thought it's in a way a bit exaggerated, and that's the reason. Of course, would have nice to have a little bit more, but it was a good salary, and that's why I think these single salaries, and it's not only the financial industry. You are from Basel, I think, Mr. Soiron. I think here, and if you compare with the United States, it's difficult comparable, because most companies in the United States had a personal union between chairman and CEO, and of course their salaries are by far even higher. I think in the European context, the Swiss ones are a bit higher. But that's up to the shareholders to decide upon that, and I think if they accept it, okay. And it's difficult to say where the market is. There are studies I got from Ernst Fehr, a very interesting study, who showed that there is a market for this high, that's the CEO, that's focused on CEO, that it's not true that this is only, wie sagt man, rein willkürlich and so on, and the Halbwertszeit der CEOs has shortened, they need a bit more money in a shorter time, and all that stuff. But I must say, for me, that was the most difficult problem during the UBS time, was this salary. And I understood the people. I cannot say I understand somebody has, I think the average salary in Switzerland is 80,000 francs. He has two children, and then he sees salaries like that. And what is the answer? You tell something, it's the market, you don't find, and it's true. That normalized now very quickly with the reduction of the volume of the investment banks, which is good. I predicted that already 3 years ago, that this will normalize. But if you are in a crisis, if you have toxic assets and you need experts to live with them, otherwise you make huge losses in billions, then you need people who can manage it, and then to go to another company and tell him, listen, you are in a very good company, you have a very high salary, I can offer you only 20% of that, and we are in a crisis, we do not know whether we survive or not, but come to me and are we really a like guy. You won't find him. And that's why that was the most difficult problem, also for our own employees, to be very frank, because they saw what happened and was criticized. But this is now has normalized very quickly, and I think a good CEO, and also if he has quite a high salary, he has a key influence on what is happening in the company. If you look at good companies, good managed companies, I think it's not only because they have a lot of good people, because they have a brain at the top who is good, and I think it's a good investment to have a good salary, but not exaggerated in the triple digit or whatever.
Let me finish you, cut you off there if I may. I know we're running out of time. Rolf, are you paid too much money? In one word.
No. But I'm in the cement industry anyway. So.
Ladies and gentlemen,
quickly.
Very quickly.
I think the question is not, are big salaries a problem per se? It is the perception, is there a reasonable relation between performance and the salary? And, just for anecdotally quoting one or two names, Brabeck's or Bulke's salaries have never been really a public debate, while others have. And I think this leads us in a direction. There are perceptions which are wrong, and at the end I do confess that Daniel Vosella was for 4 years my assistant.
I think there's food for thought there in more than one way. We could carry on for a great deal longer, but I don't want to overstretch the hospitality of our hosts, let alone the changes that have to be made here for the lecture that's going to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a fantastic debate. Those of you who aren't satisfied by the intellectual exercise we've been through, going back to my image at the beginning, if you're interested, this evening next door in the Clubsaal is Mezzanotte für Tanzlustige. And tomorrow night I can offer you Costa del Sol, best urban music with DJs, Freebie and Dubious. So those who want to really fully exercise themselves can stay here or go to the next door room. They can stay as long as they like. I think intellectually, at least, the three gentlemen here on the panel with me have given us enough intellectual exercise to keep me, and I hope all of you, satisfied for a good deal of time to come. May I please thank Kaspar Villiger, Rolf Soiron, Jean-Pierre Danthine for an excellent discussion.
Thank you.